Hi, good morning, everyone. We're just going to give it a quick minute here to let folks enter this virtual room, and we'll get started shortly. Thank you for joining us. Hi, good morning, everyone. I still see folks coming in, so we'll just give it another quick minute here and we'll get started very shortly. Thank you. All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Meta Polywall with the Orange County Water District. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited to welcome you to our December webinar, our last one of the year, Seawater Intrusion Control in Orange County. Do we need another barrier? This webinar will highlight how OCWD has combated seawater intrusion in the Orange County Groundwater Basin for decades, and particularly focus on how it was discovered in Sunset Gap, what our investigation has shown, and potential barrier concepts based on groundwater modeling. So before we begin, I did want to just mention a few items. We are in webinar mode, so attendees are muted to reduce background noise. We do encourage you to submit your questions in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. We do have a number of attendees on today's program, and we'll do our best to address questions most applicable to the webinar topic today. In the event we're not able to get to your question during the time frame allotted, we would be happy to follow up with you after the webinar and provide you with the response or any information you've requested. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on the OCWD website and YouTube channel. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce our speakers for today. They will each give their presentations first and we'll do a Q&A at the end. So Chris Casada is the water production supervisor for the city of Huntington Beach, where he has served the city and its residents with pride for over 20 years in the field of water production. Chris holds a water treatment grade 2 certification and a water distribution grade 5 certification with the state of California. And Roy Herndon is the chief of hydrogeology at the Orange County Water District, where he directs the activities of OCWD's hydrogeology department, including numerical groundwater flow modeling, performance evaluation, and improvement of 2 seawater intrusion barriers, basin-wide and local water level and water quality investigations, and the operation of a comprehensive water resources data management system. Roy is a professional geologist and certified hydrogeologist in the state of California. So we'll first hear from Chris, who will give us the lay of the land and some perspective on the unique geography of Huntington Beach. And then we'll hear from Roy on OCWD's Seawater Intrusion Program, what we're working on in the Sunset Gap area, and what's to come. So Chris, I'll hand it over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. As mentioned, my name is Chris Casada. I'm the water production supervisor here in Huntington Beach. A little bit of history on Huntington Beach. The city has owned and operated its own water utility since 1964, when it was purchased from the Southern California Water Company. So a little bit of interesting history there. That was before I was born, and the water system's grown to serve a population of over 200,000 people now. I've been with the city for over 20 years, and it's a great city to work in, great city to live in. My department is directly responsible for our wells, our reservoirs, our booster stations, and as well as flood control. We have 15 flood control facilities. So you see a map there on your screen, kind of outlines our flood risk zones in Huntington Beach. So the red indicates 100-year storm, that area would flood. And if you see the kind of amber yellow color, 500-year storm, and then the green areas are a little bit higher, so they're less likely to flood. But Huntington Beach is unique, that a third of the city is either at sea level, or some areas are even below sea level. If you could bring up the next slide, please. Yeah, so if you see the areas in light green, and there's a scale elevation ranges to the right there, you can see that a lot of the area is low lying. The pink dots up above indicate where our wells are located. So you can see they're really kind of at the edge of our city, most of them bordering Westminster. Our well 3, well 9, and well 5 are protected by the Talbert barrier. So, without OCWD's partnership with Huntington Beach, we would likely be out of business. So it's a different animal when you have to deal with being at sea level. We're unique also. We have over 80 natural gas engines that we use to pump and also for flood control. We have Huntington Beach is 77% pumped. So, we take pride in our wells. We're lucky, we're fortunate to have really good quality groundwater. Requires very little treatment, basically chlorinate it for disinfection, and we add fluoride. But other than that, it's very good quality water. We have 9 production wells that vary in depth from 250 feet all the way over about 1,000 feet. And our wells range from about 450 gallons a minute to 4,000 gallons a minute. So we've got quite a vast array of wells. Our system also includes 4 storage reservoirs with a combined capacity of 55 million gallons. So Huntington Beach, like I said, relies on that consistent groundwater that we produce. And looking at our map, you can see the challenges that we're up against having to drill a new well. We've got a couple of wells that are coming to the end of their life. They're aging out. The first obstacle is trying to find available property in Huntington Beach. There's not much real estate left, and anything that's left is being built straight up. So that's the first obstacle. And then second of all is, where we can put a well where it's not going to be too close to the seawater barrier, or where we're not going to get seawater intrusion. Our water quality department does an excellent job, and they conduct monthly expanded general physicals that include testing for chlorides, hardness, and alkalinity. Any changes in chemistry are closely monitored, as it could be an indicator of seawater intrusion. So they're constantly keeping an eye on that. Another thing that we do is any of our new wells that we construct, we use a stainless steel casing. And with the area with the water, we find that they hold up a lot better to corrosion. We don't get that rust color when we start the well, things like that. We did lose a well back in 2012. And I know Roy's going to talk a little bit more about that. Due to saltwater intrusion, and after we put facilities on it, test pumped it. So it was a bad deal, but we're hopefully heading in the right direction, and sounds like there's probably going to be a need for another barrier. So I'm going to go ahead. If nobody has any questions, I'm going to, it looks like maybe there's one question here. Chris said, what barrier? Oh, that's the Talbert barrier that protects our wells. Well 3, 9, and 5. If you look at them on the map there, that would be the Talbert barrier that protects those. So if there's no other questions, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Roy, and he can take it from here.
All right. Well, thank you, Chris. Appreciate that. We really appreciate your cooperation, coordination. Huntington Beach is a great group of folks to work with, and so I appreciate that. I guess I will go ahead and share my screen to start my part of this. There we go. All right. So, seawater intrusion is something that's been a pretty much a perpetual challenge to the coastal basin that OCWD manages. We're right up against the ocean, and as I'll describe, it's just a constant physical, natural occurrence that we have to combat, essentially, to use our basin yet not allow it to get impacted by seawater. So I'm going to talk a little bit about it in general, and then get specific to the Sunset Gap area. So for those, we do have folks from outside our area that may not know enough about OCWD, but we do manage the Orange County Groundwater Basin that supplies about 77% of all the water demands within the north and central part of Orange County. That's about 2.5 million people. And the water that's pumped from the aquifers comes from about 200 high capacity drinking water wells. So you can see the dots on the map here pretty well cover the basin, and that's how the groundwater's pumped out. In the neighborhood of 300 to 320,000 acre feet per year is kind of the typical annual pumping. And so our mission as an agency, we were formed back in 1933 by the state legislature, and it's essentially to be a groundwater management agency for the Orange County Groundwater Basin. Replenishing the aquifers, #1 priority. There we go, Seawater Intrusion Control, one of our absolutely key objectives as an agency, and to protect and improve groundwater quality. Huntington Beach is one of 19 major retail water agencies that folks that live in this area, they're the ones that you pay your water bill to. They're the ones that own and operate their production wells, and they are our key customers. These are the folks that pump almost all the groundwater out of the basin. There are some small pumpers out there, but these 19 agencies are the ones that pump most of the groundwater out, and we have monthly meetings with them, and real good coordination, and we want to keep these folks happy. And so moving on to seawater intrusion, it's something that it's kind of has some interesting history, even as far back as the 1920s, when Orange County was mostly an agricultural, rural area as a farming community with small cities. And the main use of groundwater was for irrigation for farmers. And even in the 20s, wells very close to the coast that used to be fresh water started to see salinity. And early studies indicated that the amount of groundwater pumping was more than the amount of natural recharge. This is before OCWD existed. And so the basin was essentially just being replenished with natural rainfall and occasional storm flows and things, but there was no management of the basin, and seawater started to creep in along these areas that we call gaps. The 4 arrows that you see there are the 4 gaps, and move on to the next slide here. Here are the names of them: Alamitos, Sunset, Bolsa, and Talbert Gap. They are remnants of the path of the Santa Ana River and Alamitos Gap carved out by the San Gabriel River over prehistoric time, over ancient time. The Santa Ana River would change its course due to major flood events. It was basically like a delta. And so the Santa Ana River would sweep back and forth over thousands of years and cut a new path. And what it was cutting was the uplifted area along the Newport Inglewood Fault Zone, which follows the coast from Newport Beach on up into Long Beach and all the way to Baldwin Hills up in Los Angeles. And it's a slightly uplifted area geologically And that's what you see, those mesas, those dark areas are uplifted areas that are maybe 100 feet higher than the surrounding ground, because that's the Newport Inglewood. Sometimes it's called the Newport Inglewood uplift. And yet the Santa Ana River and the San Gabriel River were able to continue to carve out pathways to the ocean, leaving behind these lower elevation areas that we call gaps. And so a lot of the early geology and understanding of the groundwater and seawater intrusion was developed by some really key, very, very good work by the USGS, Department of Water Resources, and LA County Public Works, particularly LA County up in the Alamitos Gap area. So the work that they did, the geologic interpretations they did are still very, very good, and they've held up very nicely over all these decades. And so what did OCWD do to combat seawater intrusion back in the 50s and 60s before we had any seawater intrusion barriers? Well, we filled up the groundwater basin. We bought over 2 million acre feet of Colorado River water that back in the 50s was very plentiful. It was freshly available as the initial feeder lines were brought into Southern California and Orange County. We took advantage of that and bought 2 million acre feet of it, and essentially filled up the basin by the late 1960s. And so the full basin essentially helped reverse the seawater intrusion, at least temporarily. But that was not a sustainable basin management approach. We can't just keep the basin full all the time. It completely, one, it would be very expensive, and two, you're really not utilizing the basin to its full potential, and you're not able to conjunctively use the basin. So it really helps to allow the storage to go down during droughts. You use the reservoir to get you through droughts, and then in times of surplus, you're able to replenish that available storage and fill the basin back up. So that's a much more effective way to optimize use of the groundwater basin. But to do that, you need seawater barriers. And so what we did, based on these early geologic investigations and further studies, 2 seawater barriers were developed, and these consist of a series of injection wells that inject fresh water underground in the aquifers to raise the pressures slightly above sea level, just a few feet to several feet above sea level. And by causing and maintaining the pressures underground above sea level, then that keeps the seawater, which is at sea level, from flowing inland. And so you need to maintain those pressures to keep the seawater from flowing into the basin underground. And so the Alamitos barrier went in '65, and Talbert barrier. Talbert was a farmer, and that's how that name came about. And Tom Talbert, and that barrier went in and started operating in 1975. And those are 2 of 4 seawater intrusion barriers in Southern California. We can see up south of LAX, you've got the West Coast barrier, and then down by San Pedro, the Port of LA, Port of Long Beach, you have the Dominguez barrier. So 4 seawater barriers using freshwater injection wells are operating in Southern California. So how does OCWD monitor seawater intrusion and keep track of where it is? Is it moving? Is it getting worse? Is it getting better? Well, we have over 300 monitoring wells, and we do monitor, as Chris mentioned, production wells. You certainly want to make sure your own drinking water wells are not showing signs of brackish water or salinity increases. But we've, of course, have a number of monitoring wells, hopefully as more of an early warning system before we see production wells getting affected. But you can see those dots up and down the coast where we monitor chlorides and field EC, electrical conductance, which is a good indicator. We do those twice a year. And with that data, we're able to do contours of the chloride concentrations. see if we can pull that up. There we go. And so this is a map of chloride concentrations, milligrams per liter or parts per million in chloride. And of course, chloride be a key component of seawater, sodium chloride, the salt that we see predominantly in seawater is chloride is a good, certainly a good indicator of salinity. So we use the 250 milligram per liter line as a clear indication of above background chloride. That's usually a pretty good, strong indication that you've got some brackish or saline water moving into the basin. And so that's kind of our leading edge that we use as a threshold. And then, of course, the concentrations get even higher as you move closer to the coast. So now we're going to zoom in. We can see the 4 different gaps: Alamitos, Sunset, Bolsa, and Talbert. Each one of these gaps has its own history, its own story. We could spend an hour or more on each one of these. And so just because we don't have the time today, we're going to talk about the Sunset Gap. And of all these 4 gaps, the Sunset Gap was the least understood geologically, because we thought, in the early studies sort of indicated, that it had the least threat. The geology was a little different there, and it was considered to be, compared to the other gaps, a lower priority and not as likely to have a seawater intrusion problem. Were we ever wrong about that? But as Chris mentioned, Huntington Beach Well 12 that you could see there, HB 12, that was the trigger. That was the production well that was impacted by intrusion. And that's kind of what got the Sunset Gap investigation started. So let's see here. Here is the chloride history at Huntington Beach Well 12, going back to 1995. That was about when the well was first constructed. Initially tested, chloride was fine, less than 50 milligrams per liter. Then it was equipped with its pump and motor, and they started doing some initial test pumping of the well, and chloride was under 100 milligrams per liter, so no problem. And then the well was not used for several years, didn't really go online until 2004 or so, and it operated for a couple of years. And during that time, we can see an increase, a pretty sharp increase in chloride concentrations up to about 700 milligrams per liter, which is clearly above any normal range of chloride in the basin. This is definitely an indication of some brackish water getting into this area. And of course, this is a blend. So this well is producing from a long screen interval. And so the water that we're seeing at the wellhead is a blend of probably fresh water and much more brackish water. And the blend was around 700. And so this is clearly a red flag. And it didn't take long before rusty water that Chris mentioned started to come out. And that was a sure sign of corrosion occurring. And there was this, we of course were talking with Huntington Beach at the time, and we talked about where they might want to try to pack off where we thought the brackish water was coming into the well. And so a packer was installed. That certainly caused the chloride to drop, but I'm afraid the damage was already done. The corrosion in the well, it was a mild, I think it was a mild steel well, wasn't stainless, allowed sand, the gravel pack was coming into the well. So essentially structurally it had already been fatally damaged. And so the well could not be rehabilitated. And sorry, well number 12. So it was properly destroyed and sealed. And that got everyone very closely paying attention to what was causing this. How did this brackish water get here? Where did it come from? And so, of course, there are 3 other production wells, Huntington Beach wells, 4, 7, and 13, very close to well 12. And they all have very similar screened intervals. They're all screened up around 250, 260 feet, which is the beta aquifer, is a very good quality aquifer, very prolific zone. all the way down into the 800-foot range or so. That's essentially what we call the principal aquifer system. I mean, each of the zones have different names, but the beta is the shallowest, and it goes on down to the main aquifer. But that comprises what we call often call the principal aquifer. And you could see the chlorides in well 12 that we talked about in red, and then you can see with well 4, it was showing little signs of little spikes here and there where it got up above 200 milligrams per liter. Well 7 is steady as she goes. Well 13 for the most part has been fairly constant and low, which we're very happy to see. But our concern is that we might start to see some spikes in increases in any of these 3 wells down the road, given where they're located and where they're screened. So we're keeping a really close eye on them. And so zooming in now to the Sunset Gap area, most of the Sunset Gap, which is between Landing Hill and Bolsa Chica Mesa, those are the uplifted areas, and the faults, you can see the brown lines that cut diagonally through here. These make up the Newport Inglewood fault system. And we thought these faults were really good barriers. We thought these were essentially good barriers to prevent seawater intrusion. There was not a recent aquifer that was put down after the ice age, like the Talbert aquifer or the Bolsa aquifer, which is a set of very permeable and shallow sands and gravels in the other gaps that are the primary conduit and pathway for seawater intrusion. We don't have that kind of aquifer here in the Sunset Gap. It's more of just kind of a low-lying area, but it wasn't carved deeply by the Santa Ana River. And that's why we didn't think this was an important area for us to get in and do a detailed investigation, of course, until Huntington Beach Well 12 was impacted. So essentially, here's this well 3 miles inland, this whole Sunset Gap area, which is mostly overlain by the Seal Beach Naval Weapons Station in green. That makes up most of the Sunset Gap. And, we had no reason to be on the base, and it's not easy to get on. They have high security. And so Sunset Gap for us was essentially a big data gap, and except for one monitoring well. We have one multi-depth monitoring well here that to this day has been fresh. It has never shown any sign of seawater intrusion. So, okay, that just shows you one monitoring well doesn't cover 5 square miles. And so things can happen outside that, where that well is collecting data. And here's those other 3 wells, HB 4, 7, and 13, right close by. So, and just to get folks oriented, here is the end of the Alamitos barrier. So there's a lot of data over here in the next gap, the Alamitos gap up here to the upper left, but nothing other than that one monitoring well in this whole area. So we pretty much had to start from scratch. And so back in 2010, the first thing that we did, which was relatively inexpensive, was to conduct a geophysical survey using electrical resistivity transects. We did several lines of electrical resistivity on the base, and those could look down to about 400 feet or so. And then we combined that with some electromagnetic induction soundings. They call them soundings, and they can look down to 1,000 feet. Now, it's not super high resolution data, but it does give you an indication of freshwater versus brackish versus saline water. And so we just wanted to get some general sense of it before we started to, say, put in monitoring wells. And so that's what we did with this survey. And sure enough, it did indicate as you're closer to the coast, to the southwest, the red area is where we have much higher salinity in the groundwater. And the blue would be generally fresh water. The green might be brackish. And we could see some fingers here of some higher salinity water kind of coming in from the south, and a couple of other ones kind of coming in from the south as well. So this is the kind of pattern that you get from geophysics. It's not super precise, but it certainly gives you patterns. And it told us that generally below 500 feet, the groundwater appeared fresh, but above 500 feet, we have brackish and saline water, which is what we kind of suspected, but this kind of confirmed it. So over the course of 9 years, so up to 2010, 2019, we did a series of monitoring well installations, shown here with these yellow dots or orange dots on the map. And so we certainly, we're working closely with the Navy to get access to the property. They were very cooperative, but it still took us 2 years for each time we applied for a permit to drill a well on the naval base. It still took a 2-year process to get permission, but they have been very helpful, and we've been working closely with them. And then we drilled some additional monitoring wells in 2018-19. We even did some additional geophysics just to kind of round out the edge of the base there and give us a little more information as to the orientation and depth of the salinity. So based on the data from those wells, we were now able to do a more detailed contour map. This is a water level contour map. The blue lines are groundwater elevations relative to sea level. And so you can see the groundwater starts, maybe at, well, over here in the Alamitos Gap, close to sea level, and then goes down to about 16 feet below sea level. So that's the gradient. Groundwater flows from higher elevations to lower elevations. That's what the flow lines, the green arrows, are the direction that groundwater is flowing, and they flow perpendicular to these elevation contours. And so it makes sense that groundwater will flow towards your areas of pumping. The wells pump, they lower the groundwater levels, and that draws in groundwater. And so, we're able to put a pattern together, and we've kind of spoiled the spoiler alert. Here's the edge of the brackish water here with the 250 milligram per liter leading edge chloride. And so this next map shows the rest of the chloride concentration. So we've gone from groundwater elevation contours to groundwater chloride concentration. So this is the concentration of chloride in groundwater in milligrams per liter. And just for reference, seawater has chloride concentrations of about 17,000 milligrams per liter is the kind of typical seawater concentration for chloride. And so here we have wells that have chloride of 15,000. So they're essentially, the salinity is right up there with seawater in the aquifer in this part of the weapons station, which is actually where the wildlife, the Seal Beach National Wildlife Refuge, is on the base. The base has a wildlife refuge, and so that happens to be the highest concentration in the groundwater. And so we essentially are trying to figure out what areas it is. Is it a specific location where seawater is getting into the basin, or is it coming in from a number of locations? And unfortunately, it looks like it's coming in from multiple locations. It looks like there is a source coming in from Alamitos Gap. There appears to be seawater getting across the fault, which we didn't think was likely, but it appears to be happening. It appears to also be vertically migrating downward from the tidal area of the wildlife refuge, and in an area where it doesn't appear there are enough clay layers or low permeability zones to block that vertical flow of salinity. So it's getting essentially straight down into the principal aquifer, into the drinking water aquifers. And also the Huntington Harbor area also appears to be a likely source given the concentrations that we're seeing in this area. So it looks like we have a pretty broad area here that where seawater is able to get in and cause this pattern of chloride concentrations. And here, of course, are the production wells that are threatened by this chloride. So let's look three-dimensionally. We're just looking in plan view here. So let's take a slice through this area so you get a sense of the geology. And that's what we see here. So to the left is the ocean and Huntington Harbor. To the right is inland in the where the production wells are. And so we can see the aquifers aren't really dipping a whole lot here. They're not tilted like we see in some of the other gaps. And that is what's different about this gap. It has a little bit different geology, but it's the same general ideas. Once groundwater is able to get to a particular aquifer depth, an aquifer zone, it's going to flow under the natural gradient within that aquifer. And that gradient is going to take that water towards a production well, because the production wells are the end point of groundwater in our basin. We don't really lose groundwater out of our basin. There is some flow over to LA County, but the vast majority of all the water that gets recharged in the Orange County Groundwater Basin ends up in a production well. And so we can see the zone that has the highest chloride concentration is this beta aquifer. And the beta all the way down to the main make up what we call the principal aquifer system. So it's a series of aquifers, and we just call it, for simplistic terms, just call it the principal, because that's where most of the production wells are screened. You can see the screened intervals here of well 13. That's typical. And so it draws water from multiple aquifer depths, including the beta. And so it's the beta and the lambda that have the highest concentrations and flowing from left to right. So there's a bit of a picture. Of course, the brown layers represent the lower permeability, the clays and the silts that do slow groundwater from flowing vertically. It wants to flow more laterally than vertically, but anytime there's an opening between aquifers, there's a downward, the water wants to flow downward and sideways, and it will take that opportunity to move from one aquifer down to another. So that's why we have the seawater down 300 feet. So what do we do about all this now that we're starting to get a picture of the extent of intrusion, is where it is, where it's moving, where it's heading? How are we going to solve this problem? How are we going to address this? Well, that's where groundwater flow models come in handy. It's a computer representation of the aquifer systems that you can run scenarios. You need to calibrate the model so that they represent, so that it represents historical conditions. So you have some confidence in the value and the results of the model for future simulations. And so we took an existing model. We used an outside consultant, Intera, who built the Alamitos model for us 10 years ago or so. And we expanded it, or they expanded it, basically almost tripled the size of the model. You can see we went from the blue area to the red, and because we needed to extend the model to cover the whole Sunset Gap area so that we could run different scenarios for a potential seawater barriers. And so that was about a 2 to 3 year process to do the hydrogeology interpretations, and then build the model, calibrate the model, run scenarios. So that was a lot, mostly obviously all office work. After you get in the field, out in the field, you come into the office and you compile all the data and you start figuring it all out and running computer scenarios. So, but you need to start with the concept. What would you do? What might you do to address this intrusion? And so you start with your understanding of where the intrusion is and where it's flowing. And you think, okay, let's try to corral this chloride. Let's try to corral and keep this intrusion from further impacting the groundwater basin. And so conceptually, we thought maybe a series of injection wells roughly following the edge of the, at least the part of the Navy base, cuts through Westminster, cuts through the base. Actually, it extends to the north, but Westminster is a public right of way. And so we thought maybe, and it also happens to follow kind of the edge of the chloride contours. And then we thought, okay, well, it may not be practical to extend a barrier way out into this heavily developed area and try to zigzag a pipeline and a bunch of injection wells through here. Plus, the concentrations are lower in this area, and maybe that chloride will dilute and not be a problem. So we just thought from a logistical standpoint, it might make sense to just try to angle the barrier, the conceptual barrier down along Bolsa Chica Road here along the edge of the base. So this is a concept that we wanted to try out in the model. On top of the injection wells, we thought in this particular case, we probably need some extraction wells. And that's something that we've tried in other gaps, but we didn't really need them. They weren't really located in the right place, and they weren't really necessary. We were able to just do injection only, and that has been successful. But in this area, because of the fault, if we didn't consider putting in extraction wells, we probably would just build up the water levels, because we're essentially blocking off everything up to the fault. And this will all fill up, and eventually this brackish water will start punching through the in between the injection wells. So you actually have to give the brackish water or the saline water in the middle a place to go. So you need to give it a little bit of a pressure relief valve. And so the concept was we probably need at least some extraction to allow for lower water levels, so water will move in and stay in the higher concentration areas and not try to get out of the corral. So that was the concept, is to push water, fresh water inward, extract the brackish water, and then obviously protect the main basin from further intrusion. That's the concept. But what kind of flow rates would you need? How many injection wells might you need? How many extraction wells might you need to accomplish this? So after running several scenarios, we end up with one that we thought worked pretty well. We tried different flow rates. We tried different well patterns and densities, different numbers of extraction wells and different amounts of extraction, to where it looks like average injection across about 34 wells at 20 locations. The numbers here represent the number of injection wells. That means they would inject into different zones, different depths. Some have 3, some only have 1, that we're only conceptually injecting into one aquifer. That's how you end up with 34 wells at 20 locations. The average injection of 13 million gallons a day looked like it was sufficient to keep seawater from moving farther inland. And extraction of only about 3 million gallons a day appeared to be sufficient to give a place for the groundwater that you're trying to keep from getting into the main basin, a place for it to go. Because we can't drive the groundwater back across the fault. That's the short answer. If this fault weren't here and you inject enough fresh water, you will eventually push that fresh water back across the fault, or the saline water. But this fault, it's not a perfect barrier, but it is a pretty good barrier in terms of hydraulically not allowing just unimpeded seawater. It does act as an impediment, but it's not a perfect impediment, and it clearly is allowing seawater to get around it or past it. So we can't push water back across the fault. It just wouldn't work because it is somewhat of a barrier. So that's why the extraction wells are there. But consider that these flow rates, this 13 MGD for injection and the 3 MGD of extraction, those are averages across a whole year. And because the groundwater basin seasonally goes up and down, probably the actual injection in the summertime might be double that. It might be 20 MGD or so. And in the winter, it might only be 6 MGD, because you don't need to inject as much in the winter because water levels are higher. And in the summer, they're lower because that's when people are pumping more, and you actually need to inject more because you want to try to maintain a constant elevation to, keep the seawater from moving past you. So that's an average. Those flow rates are average. So that's that. So here's an output from the model that shows the basically enclosed depression from pumping those 3 extraction wells there. That shows that the flow from the barrier, the groundwater will flow from the barrier and force that saline water back towards the middle and keep it there. And you're basically pumping 3 MGD. And question is, what do you do with that water? Do you desalt it and then use it as part of your injection supply? That may be a cost-effective solution to provide some of the flow to your barrier, is your desalted brackish water. maybe it's so saline that it's not worth it to run it through RO, but that's something to be determined later. But the majority of the water that's being injected will flow out into the main basin and act as a recharge facility, just like the other barriers are. So yes, we do lose a little bit of the injection water to the ocean. In this case, a little bit of the injection water will get extracted, but it's a small fraction of the total amount of injection. If you're injecting 13 MGD, but you're only extracting 3, you know you're not losing more than 3 MGD of the injection water, and I don't even think it's that much. So that just shows you how the model can be used to simulate the flow patterns that would be developed with an injection extraction type system. And this is another output from the model, and this is a chloride concentration map using shades instead of contours. The shades, the red and the orange, are higher salinity, the green and the blue are very low salinity. And it shows, we just ran the model for 5 years, and it showed after 5 years, we started to cut off this portion of the chloride that was already east of Bolsa Chica. And so you could see fresh water is starting to develop here where you're injecting fresh water. And you're seeing that along this leg of the conceptual barrier along Westminster Boulevard. So maybe a little bit of punch through, but this looked really good. And, you know, at the level that we are at this stage, it looks like we're in the ballpark as far as the amount of injection that might be needed. So again, we're very much in the early stages. And if we were to run the model for another 5 or 10 years, you would see these shading, these patterns continue to collapse on each other and get smaller to where it would just be mostly probably around the shaded area would be closer to the extraction wells, and that you would eventually freshen up this area. So that is the model results, and we certainly have more modeling to do, which I'll get to. And as we speak, we are finishing up with 5 additional sets of monitoring wells to help round out our understanding of areas where we still didn't really have good data. And as we've learned, we don't want to really leave any major stones, any big stones unturned, because those are going to be the ones where the seawater intrusion is going, and we didn't look there. So we're not looking everywhere. We just want to cover a few likely spots. So we're just finishing up with this well way down here on the edge of the map. And then so these 4 are essentially will be finished by the holidays for the most part. And this last well, or a couple of wells to be constructed here in Seal Beach, will be done in mid-January. And then that will conclude our current plan for well drilling. We probably will need wells in the future, but in terms of investigating what we think we need to investigate, we think these wells should suffice. And so we'll be happy to get back to the office and take the data from these new wells, incorporate it into the model, extend the calibration up to June of 2020. The model currently is calibrated through 2017. We want to add 4 years of calibration data to it. And then I think at that point, we'll be ready to take this to our board. We'd like to present it to the groundwater producers. We'd also like to present it to some key stakeholders who are involved with investigations in this area. We have some environmental contamination. The Navy has a site that they're remediating. VOCs, the regional board, Department of Toxics, and the responsible parties, Boeing being one of them, and a couple others, have groundwater remediation projects going on. And we want to understand if we're going to affect these plumes with a potential seawater barrier. So we definitely need to work with them, and we have been. So we want to have some follow-up meetings with them and present to them what we're presenting to you. And I think we may hopefully have some folks from these agencies on this webinar today. The next step would be, assuming the board approves this, would be to conduct a feasibility study to look at injection supply alternatives. I mean, there's lots of potential sources of injection water. It could be recycled water from GWRS. Yes, that would take a big, long pipeline. That'd be very expensive. Imported water is another option. Also, there's some very deep aquifers that are not susceptible to seawater intrusion that potentially could be a source of injection water. We simply pump from a very deep aquifer and re-inject into the shallower aquifers. And that's a possible. We actually did that for the Talbot Barrier as part of the supply for years. As we mentioned, brackish water from the extraction wells certainly isn't enough to supply the barrier, but maybe that's an option as well, or some combination of these to supply the water needed to inject. So that's a feasibility analysis. We would look at costs, we'd look at feasibility of installation, of locating facilities, and so on, O&M over time, and see what makes the most sense. Obviously, siting for pipelines, land access, utility clearance, all those kinds of things that you can do on paper before you actually go to any detailed design would need to be done. And then down the road, you'd need to look at where would you need to put in additional monitoring wells if you were to install a seawater barrier, because you need enough to know that your barrier is performing properly, and that might be some additional properly spaced wells in addition to the ones that we've already constructed to investigate the extent of the contamination. You need enough to monitor the performance of the barrier to make sure you're not missing anything. And lastly, we want to do a no barrier alternative analysis. We want to do some model runs and some evaluation of what if you did not construct a seawater barrier, what would happen to the seawater intrusion? How far inland might it go? How many wells would be impacted? What kind of groundwater desalters would you have to construct? And so on. A lot of interesting ideas there, and it makes sense to at least look at it just to say you did. And then who knows, maybe that ends up being something that makes more sense than building a barrier. That would certainly be out of the box, but our logo, our motto used to be, and I think still is a tradition of innovation. So just because it's worked in the past, maybe a new way of looking at it in the future. So we're open to any possibility, and it may end up not working out that way on paper, but we want to at least evaluate it. I think that's all I had, and so I'd be happy to answer any questions if we have time.
Thanks so much, Roy, and thank you, Chris, as well for your presentations. And I know we do have several questions coming in through the Q&A box here. And I just want to share a note to our attendees that we are coming close to the hour. Our speakers have so kindly agreed to stay on for a few minutes after the hour to make sure we could address these questions. And if, again, for any reason we're not able to get to them, we'll certainly follow up with you after the fact. So if you're able to stick with us for a little bit longer, Roy and Chris have kindly agreed to do so as well. So Roy, Chris, would it be helpful to just walk through the Q&A here?
Sure,
I think for flow, it might be best for you all to maybe take a look at some of the questions coming in and start tackling them.
Okay, and I'll try not to hog them all.
Yeah, I think they're mostly for you, Roy. I've looked at most of them as they've come in, but
not a problem. I'll just try to move quickly. How did subsidence from oil and gas removal affect this? There was some subsidence back in the early 1900s associated with oil and gas production, particularly in the Long Beach area. I don't know how much subsidence might have occurred in the early 1900s in the Sunset Gap area. Whatever it happened, I'm not aware that there's any continuing subsidence from oil and gas removal. So I think it's whatever it was, it happened and it stabilized. So that's my understanding. So I don't think there's going to be an issue there. Are all barriers injecting fresh water in the beta aquifer? Yes, the beta, we're injecting into it in the Talbot barrier. We're injecting into it at the Alamitos barrier. So yes, and we would be if we were to build a Sunset barrier, definitely in the beta. Do we see any seawater intrusion in the alpha? Yes, definitely. The alpha is the aquifer above the beta. But the beta seems to be the one that has the steepest gradient, and it's very gravelly, it's very permeable. And so that in the Sunset Gap, that's the one that has the worst. But the alpha definitely has some intrusion as well. It just hasn't gone as far inland as the beta in the Sunset Gap. Kelly Rowe, Kelly, hi Kelly. Yeah, isn't it only in the beta? It's mostly in the beta, but the above the beta and the alpha, closer to the ocean, there's definitely intrusion in the alpha, just not as far inland as the beta. Let's see, in the 1950s, where and how did they get the 2 million acre feet of Colorado River in the aquifer? Basically, or 2 million, yeah, basically we took it, there was a major feeder line still there that currently now gets to the Deemer plant, Deemer filtration plant. We would take water off of that line, raw Colorado River water, and we would divert it into the Santa Ana River. So we essentially use the Santa Ana River as the main source of ability to recharge the aquifer. So it's just surface water replenishment using the Santa Ana River as our major means of percolating it in the ground. I heard that one year we percolated something like 200,000 acre feet of Colorado River water just using the river. What are the depths of the injection wells along the barrier? Are the base of the wells terminated in a low permeability unit? The Sunset Barrier, the wells, conceptually, they would probably go down to about 350 feet or so. And typically they would terminate at the bottom of the aquifer that we're trying to inject into. So usually we'll drill till we hit a clay layer and then terminate the well at that depth and then screen above it. And that's typically what we do. Chloride contour maps. How deep into the aquifer do the contour lines represent? The maps I showed you were for I just picked one aquifer. I picked the beta because that's the one that has the most inland extent. And that one, the depths were around 300 feet, 250 to 300 feet. That's kind of the range of the beta. Kira or Meta, just cut me off. Just pull the, get the hook if I'm going too fast or too long. Could a network of brackish water desalination facilities placed on the seawater side of the barriers help to prevent further intrusion? Yes, they could work. I don't know whether you could do theoretically an extraction only. I guess what we could run a scenario. I think we probably will run a scenario like that. I just don't know if that would be the most economic way to go about doing it. So, but I guess I think we're going to be looking at a no injection barrier option. So we may, if we do this feasibility study, we could evaluate that. So theoretically, it might work. It's just a question of, are running a bunch of brackish desal facilities in the long run going to be the most economic way to go? How will sea level rise affect the barriers? Great question. We've done some modeling of that. And if we have 3 feet of sea level rise, which is in the range of what they're projecting over the next 50 or 100 years, that would probably be too much for our barriers. We would need to come up with some additional measures beyond just injection if the sea level were to rise 3 feet. Was there any numerical modeling using variable density modeling? We're going to do that in the next few months. We did evaluate using a density dependent model. We didn't think it was important, but we're going to go back and look at it again just to make sure. That's kind of modeling inside stuff. But yes, we're going to, because seawater is denser than fresh water and you don't want to completely ignore it in your modeling. It looks like the Newport Inglewood fault controls seawater intrusion for the deep horizons. Yes. Does the fault control deeper intrusion in the other gaps? Yes and yes. We have wells down, and we don't just assume. We put wells down in the fresh water in those deep zones on the inland side of the fault, and they've been staying fresh. So it appears as though the deep aquifers are being protected by the Newport Inglewood fault. That's like 700-800 feet and deeper. What are the tidal effects on seawater intrusion? It really doesn't. It's a very localized thing. Tides definitely affect groundwater levels. The closer to the coast you are, you can see a foot or two change in the groundwater levels, but the aquifer really dampens the effect of tides. So you don't really see the tides transmitting themselves far inland to any degree that would affect seawater intrusion. Why not align your barrier from Seal Beach and Boulevard to Bolsa Chica? You can save about 30%. Yeah, we actually looked at an angled barrier, but for one, you're cutting off the chlorides that you need to stop. So it doesn't look like it would work. So anyway, we did look at that. We could talk some more about that. Let's see, to what extent where multi-level monitoring wells used to create vertical profiles of chloride concentrations and help them? Well, all the places where we've drilled monitoring wells, we have drilled in multiple aquifers, sometimes up to 5 different zones that we've screened just to see, is it seawater in this zone, but not this zone? Where's the bottom of it? So we have been using multi-level wells for our characterization. What type of pipe material has been used in the wells and pipes? The injection wells are using very high quality stainless steel. We did have some mild steel injection wells that we thought, well, they're only injecting fresh water, they'll never corrode. Well, sometimes seawater gets to your injection wells. At least it did at Alamitos, and we wiped out some mild steel wells. So no, we use stainless steel injection wells, and the pipes are either what we used. Well, they're all running fresh water. So I think we used a variety. I think we've got some transit pipe and iron and so on. So we've got different pipes for injection. But yeah, those at least inject fresh water continuously. Let's see, where are we now? Are the injection well rates from the proposed barrier controlled temporarily to adjust? Yes, we are going to have to adjust. We would have to adjust our injection to account for seasonal changes like we do at the Talbert barrier and the Alamitos barrier. Yes, we would. Is the water for injection going to be supplied by the Leo Vanderlands or GWRS? Well, we're going to look at any recycled water option. Well, if we do the feasibility study, that would be one of the key questions we would answer. Vanderlands is pretty well maxed out on just supplying the Alamitos barrier. So I don't think it would be a likely source for any other barrier. Can a constructed wetland treat some salty water and the treated water be used? Well, the wetlands really don't remove salt. So it's possible, certainly if we were to discharge the extracted water from those extraction wells, it would be very brackish, and we would have to make sure we meet all discharge requirements wherever that water were to be discharged. So it could go through a wetland. So yes, it's possible that could be a place that water could be discharged if it didn't cause any negative effects. Does the California anti-degradation policy affect the injection project? I don't think so, because we would be injecting water that meets all requirements for injection into a potable aquifer, just like the Talbert barrier and the Alamitos barrier. We would have to follow if it were to be recycled water, we would have to follow the recycled water recharge regulations. But yeah, it would meet all requirements to be able to put it in the ground. So it really wouldn't be causing any anti-degradation. I mean, it would comply with anti-degradation because it wouldn't cause any degradation. Yes, we have several remediation sites in close proximity to the gap. And so we definitely need to be talking with the regulatory agencies. And so we need to get that some meetings on the calendar with regional board and DTSC. Would this new seawater barrier cost anything? It would definitely cost something up front. It would be a huge capital investment, and it would have O&M costs associated with it, just like our other barriers. So yes, it would be a very major capital project if it were to go forward. Do the scenarios for the groundwater model incorporate estimates of sea level rise to climate change? I don't believe the current baseline runs and scenarios that we've done incorporate sea level rise, but a foot or two at sea level, it doesn't affect the major analysis that we've done. At least our extraction wells, we continue to extract and we create a pumping depression, even if the ocean in the Sunset Gap were a foot or two higher. At some point though, as I mentioned, sea level rise could become a real problem. I think it's gonna become a problem for inundation. This is where Chris comes in. It's going to be a land surface inundation problem, I think, before it becomes a groundwater problem. So I think we've got multiple issues to deal with sea level rise, as everybody knows. I think I already covered the sea level rise. Do we have desalters in place now, or are they not needed yet? We don't have any desalters in place. That we have not needed them at this time, so haven't needed them. We might in the future though. Will reports summarizing the work performed to date be available to the public? Yes, I mean, we have some tech memos on the modeling. We haven't really written up anything. This PowerPoint presentation is kind of a lot of what we've done, but otherwise we have groundwater model technical memos that have a lot of hydrogeology in them that are publicly available if people would like that. Okay, possible for you to share geophysicals? Yes, we can. We have the geophysical survey reports we can provide, absolutely. And did you find any changes in salinity in wells associated with the tidal wave? No, the aquifer acts as a pretty good buffer to tidal waves. So it's, we wouldn't see any likely changes due to a tsunami. Can we get email of both speakers? Yes. Now, Chris won't give his out. I know that. But no, how are we doing, Kira? Should we keep going or what do you think?
You know what, Roy? Thank you so much. This is game show level Q&A here. This is great. I really appreciate it. You know, I think if you have just another minute or so to look through if there are any you know, burning questions or maybe a common theme here that you'd like to kind of close on.
Sure.
But for those that, you know, we aren't able to get to, thank you so much for sharing your email address, you know, with your question, because we do want to circle back with you and get you these responses. So I appreciate that, Roy. Thank you.
No, these are all really good questions. I mean, they're just coming, you know, they all make sense. And so I really appreciate it. And I think we would like to get back to everybody because they are really good questions. I want to get people's questions answered. So obviously we have a lot more work to do at OCWD before we are saying we're going to build this barrier. I mean, we still have a lot of discussion internally with our management, and we want to make sure we're going about this very carefully and methodically and thoughtfully. So we certainly have a lot more work to do, but there's only so many ways you can stop seawater intrusion, and so the ocean is not going away and we have a basin to protect. So it may be something we're certainly going to have to address it in one fashion or another. And we're just trying to analyze different options and see what makes the most sense. So we look forward to future updates as we get farther along. I think this is, now that we've got everybody interested, we need to get back and every 6 months or a year or so after we have something to show, provide updates on what we're currently thinking. So I really appreciate the interest, and I appreciate Chris for being our partner on all this. You're right on the front lines.
Well, thank you, Roy. Like I said, you know, Huntington Beach absolutely needs this partnership to keep us going and keep us in fresh water. And you guys do an excellent job maintaining the basin. You know, I tell people all the time what a great job you guys do. We appreciate it.
Great. Thank you so much, Roy and Chris. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that, you know, part of the Q&A too, there were several comments coming in, thanking you both for your excellent presentation. Comments ranging from, you know, being able to take such a complex presentation or topic and drilling it down for us today. So I just wanted to share that with you publicly as well. And I appreciate for those of you who shared those comments with our speakers today. I too agree. Great presentations and definitely more to come, both in terms of responding to the robust Q&A that we received today and more to come on the project and the program in the future. So Roy and Chris, I just want to thank you again. I want to thank you for staying on a little bit longer, and thank you so much to all our attendees for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed it. Certainly received a lot of engagement, a lot of questions and interest. And one of the questions was about a recording and when this will be available. So I do want to remind folks that the webinar is recorded and it will be available on OCWD's website and YouTube channel within the next 24 hours here. So it'll be up there for you to see. So thank you so much, everyone, and want to wish everyone a happy holidays and look forward to seeing you all next year.
Very good.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye, thanks.